The story begins where the map ends, somewhere in the dense, whispering woods of eastern Kentucky, where the air carries the scent of decay and forgotten sins. Locals call it Ashworth Hollow, though few will point to it on a map, and fewer still will speak its name after dark. The forest there feels different. The trees lean too close together, the wind carries voices instead of rustling leaves, and sometimes, when the moon sits low, a pale light flickers between the trunks as if something is still working down there, beneath the soil. It was in the fall of 1972 when two hikers, lost and desperate for shelter, stumbled upon the remnants of a log cabin swallowed by vines and time. The floorboards creaked with the sound of secrets trying to breathe again. On the shelves were glass jars, hundreds of them, each filled with a murky amber liquid and something floating inside. What they saw that night sent one man screaming into the forest and left the other mute for the rest of his life. Authorities later called it a collection of medical artifacts, but no report ever made it past the county line. The Ashworths had been gone for decades by then, an entire family swallowed by rumor and rot. Yet their legend never really died. To some, they were country doctors who lost their way in isolation. To others, they were something far worse, harvesters of flesh, merchants of anatomy, making their living from the bodies of the vanished. When you walk the old trails of Boone County, it's said you can still hear the clinking of jars and the faint hiss of breath beneath the earth, as though the woods themselves remember what the Ashworths built here and what they refused to let die. And if you ever find yourself deep enough in those woods to feel the air grow heavy and the smell of iron in your nose, remember, somewhere below your feet, 100 eyes may still be watching, preserved in amber, waiting for you to listen. In the autumn of 1972, when the fog rolled thick over the eastern Kentucky mountains, two hikers named Michael Grady and Leon Peterson ventured off the marked trail in search of a shortcut back to town. They had been camping along an old mining route that few dared to tread anymore, a place the locals described as cursed ground where compasses spun wild and animals refused to linger. As dusk crept through the trees, the men found themselves swallowed by the forest silence, their lanterns cutting narrow tunnels of light through the mist. It was then that Leon caught sight of something through the tangled vines, a structure, sunken and forgotten, hidden behind a curtain of creeping ivy and black oak. What looked at first like the remains of a hunting shack revealed itself to be an old log cabin, its roof half collapsed, its windows sealed with warped planks that groaned in the wind. The smell hit them before they reached the door, something sickly sweet and metallic that clung to the air like rot mixed with chemicals. Inside, the darkness felt alive. Dust swirled in the glow of their lanterns, and the floorboards sagged under their boots, threatening to give way with every step. On the far wall stood shelves, entire rows of them, each lined with glass jars. Some were shattered, their contents spilled into dark puddles that glistened in the flickering light, but most were intact, capped with rusted lids and filled with cloudy liquid. What lay suspended inside was what froze the men where they stood. Faces, limbs, organs, human remains carefully preserved, each distorted by time yet unmistakably real. Eyes, pale and bloated, stared out through the glass like they were still searching for escape. One jar held a small hand, its nails still pink beneath the fluid, another an entire head, mouth open as though caught mid-scream. Michael staggered back, muttering something incoherent, while Leon lifted one of the jars for a closer look. The moment he did, the light from his lantern flickered violently, as if the air itself rebelled against their intrusion. Somewhere deep in the cabin came the soft sound of dripping water, or perhaps something else, rhythmic and faint, like breathing. When the jar slipped from Leon's hands and shattered on the floor, the stench became unbearable. Michael bolted for the door, crashing through the brush in blind panic, while Leon stood frozen, staring at the spot where the jar had broken. He swore he saw movement in the viscous puddle, something stirring, shifting as though alive. By the time authorities returned days later, only one hiker could be found. Leon Peterson was discovered half a mile from the cabin, eyes wide open, lungs filled with mud, his mouth twisted into a silent scream that no one could explain. The discovery of the Ashworth cabin sent shockwaves through Boone County, but it was the subsequent investigation into the missing families that truly revealed the depth of the horror buried in those Kentucky woods. When authorities began combing through old records, they found a chilling pattern stretching back decades. Between 1919 and 1946, entire families had vanished from the surrounding area, farmers, travelers, and even peddlers who were last seen heading toward the hills near Ashworth Hollow. Some had gone missing on foggy nights while returning from town, others disappeared without a trace from their own homes, leaving dinner plates on tables and lanterns still burning. The disappearances were scattered across years and counties, but when plotted on a map, every case seemed to orbit a single location, the land once owned by the Ashworth family. Old newspaper clippings spoke of the Kentucky vanishings, a phenomenon that locals chalked up to moonshiners, highway robbers, or the unforgiving wilderness itself. But there were details that didn't fit. Search parties found no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, and no bodies, only silence. A farmer named Clayton Reeves and his 3 sons vanished in 1923. Their livestock were discovered days later, wandering aimlessly, but the family dog was found dead near the edge of the Ashworth property, its body showing precise, surgical incisions. In 1930, a young schoolteacher named Lila Warren disappeared on her way to visit her sister. Her bicycle was found propped neatly against a tree just 5 miles from the Ashworth cabin, the tires still inflated, as though she had simply stepped off and evaporated into thin air. The most unsettling clue came from an old county ledger where missing persons were noted by hand. On the margins of several entries from the 1930s, someone had drawn tiny ink symbols, circles intersected by crosses, that matched faint carvings later found on the trees surrounding the Ashworth homestead. No one could determine who made them or why. Some of the older residents whispered that those marks were warnings, signs placed by those who knew the truth about what happened in those woods. Yet, as the years went on and the Ashworth name faded from memory, the disappearances slowed, almost as if the forest itself had gone dormant after feeding for too long. By the time the 1970s investigators reopened the files, many of the victims' relatives were long dead, their stories reduced to folklore told around campfires. But those who still remembered swore that when the wind blew from the east, it carried voices, pleading, muffled, and distant echoes of those who had walked toward the Ashworth land and never walked back out. Long before the Ashworth cabin became a monument to fear, its patriarch, Dr. Ellis Ashworth, had already carved his name into infamy. In the early 1900s, he was a respected surgeon in Lexington, known for his precise hands and unorthodox brilliance. But brilliance often hides obsession, and for Ellis, medicine was never about healing, it was about control. Colleagues described him as a man fascinated by the thin line between life and death, one who viewed the human body as an elaborate puzzle to be taken apart and reassembled at will. His downfall began when a series of strange complaints emerged from families of the deceased. Graves were being found disturbed, bodies missing from coffins, and cadavers that had been entrusted to the city morgue for burial seemed to vanish altogether. Rumors spread through the medical community that Ellis was conducting experiments after hours, using corpses procured through means best left unspoken. When authorities finally confronted him, they found evidence that linked him to illegal dissection and the black market trade of human remains to medical schools desperate for study material. Though he was never formally charged with murder, the scandal was enough to destroy his career. His medical license was revoked, and he was quietly encouraged to leave the city before the newspapers learned more. Most believed that was the end of him, but a few years later, reports surfaced of a man matching his description purchasing a tract of land deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, far from the reach of law and scrutiny. There, Ellis rebuilt his life with his wife, Martha, and their 2 children, under the guise of running a small rural practice. Locals saw him as a recluse, polite but unsettling, with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. He rarely came to town, and when he did, it was often after dark, trading jars of clear liquid and wrapped parcels to traveling merchants. The few patients who sought his care claimed his methods were crude but effective, though most described an unease that lingered after they left his home. Whispers began to spread again when livestock and pets started disappearing, followed by the first missing person cases in the nearby villages. Some said Ellis was searching for something, perhaps perfection in anatomy, or a way to cheat decay itself. Others believed he was attempting to create a kind of life that couldn't die, experimenting on both the dead and the living in equal measure. Whatever his purpose, the forest soon grew quiet around his land, and those who once visited the Ashworth cabin learned to avoid it entirely, fearing what might still be waiting behind those shuttered windows where the good doctor continued his work in silence. As whispers about the Ashworth family deepened, a darker truth began to emerge, one that painted them not merely as twisted recluses, but as active participants in a hidden trade that stretched far beyond the Kentucky hills. Locals who lived closest to their land began telling stories about the body wagons that came through the woods late at night, led by men who never showed their faces and left before dawn. The wagons carried crates sealed in tar and wrapped in burlap, always accompanied by the faint smell of alcohol and formaldehyde. It was said that Dr. Ellis Ashworth and his eldest son were selling preserved human remains, bones, organs, and even entire torsos to buyers across the eastern states. Some believed their customers were medical schools desperate for anatomy models, others whispered that collectors of the macabre paid handsomely for the grotesque trophies. The trade was as profitable as it was horrifying. Rumors spoke of Ellis preparing the specimens himself, using a formula of his own invention that prevented decay and kept tissue unnaturally pliable. The formula's composition was never discovered, but the results were undeniable. Jars pulled from the ruins decades later contained flesh that had resisted the years, eyes still intact, veins still visible beneath the glass. The idea that such preservation could exist in the early 20th century baffled experts, leading many to believe that Ellis had stumbled upon something far more sinister than chemistry. Farmhands who worked nearby claimed they sometimes saw strangers at the Ashworth property, well-dressed men from the city, carrying leather cases and speaking in low tones with Ellis at the gate. Money exchanged hands, and the men would leave with crates loaded into their carriages, the contents hidden beneath thick canvas. It became an unspoken rule in the nearby towns that one did not ask questions about those who went missing, nor about the faint smell of burning flesh that sometimes drifted down from the hollow after midnight. When the disappearances increased, suspicion grew, but no one dared confront the Ashworths. Their property was guarded by dogs that were never seen by daylight, and their patriarch had a way of looking at people that made the blood run cold. Over time, the family's reputation curdled into legend. They were called the body merchants of Boone County, a name spoken with both awe and disgust in hushed tavern corners. But beneath the folklore was an uncomfortable truth: the Ashworths weren't working alone. Someone, somewhere, was funding them, ordering the shipments, and keeping their business alive long after the last light went out in that cursed cabin. And even decades later, fragments of their trade, bones marked with serial numbers, jars labeled with initials, would wash up from the soil like ghosts that refused to stay buried. Among the ruins of the Ashworth cabin, investigators discovered a half-burned diary wedged beneath a rotting floorboard, a child's journal, its pages warped by time and soot. It belonged to Mary Ashworth, the youngest daughter of Dr. Ellis Ashworth, who would have been no more than 12 when she wrote it. The handwriting was delicate, wavering between innocence and terror, its ink smudged in places where small hands had trembled. At first glance, it seemed like the diary of a lonely girl living in isolation, filled with descriptions of the forest, her dolls, and the sound of her mother's humming echoing through the hallways. But as the pages turned, the tone changed, and the entries became darker, fragmented by fear and confusion. Mary began to mention the visitors who came after sundown, men who never spoke to her but always brought money and left with boxes that her father carried into the cellar. One passage described how her father called them his clients and warned her never to look directly at them. Another spoke of the nights of harvest, when her mother would fill the lamps and her father would send her to her room, telling her to cover her ears and hum to drown out the noise. Mary wrote that sometimes the noises didn't sound human, that they came from below the floor, muffled and wet, followed by her father's calm voice reciting words she didn't understand. In one chilling entry dated October 12, 1931, she confessed that her brother had begun helping their father and that she could hear them arguing late at night about how many bodies the wagon could carry. She mentioned that her brother wanted to stop, but her father said stopping wasn't an option, that they owed the collectors more than they could ever repay. Scattered among her words were childlike drawings, figures without faces, jars filled with floating shapes, and a crude sketch of the cabin with dark lines drawn beneath it, suggesting rooms underground. On one of the final pages, burned along the edges, she wrote that her mother had become sick after one of the harvest nights, her skin turning pale and her eyes darkening as if she were fading from within. The last legible line of the diary simply read, "Father says the forest will take care of her now." After that, the entries stopped abruptly, and the remaining pages were blackened, as though someone had tried to destroy them in haste. The diary was the only written trace of the family's existence, but what it revealed transformed the Ashworth story from rumor into something tangible, a glimpse into a child's witness of unimaginable horror, penned with the trembling honesty of innocence corrupted by something she could never fully understand. In the summer of 1932, after years of mounting disappearances and whispered accusations, the Boone County Sheriff's Department finally organized a raid on the Ashworth property. The decision came after the sudden vanishing of two local boys whose bicycles were found abandoned near the hollow, their footprints leading toward the dense stretch of forest surrounding the family's land. Sheriff William Harlan, a hard man with a reputation for fearlessness, gathered a team of 6 deputies and 2 bloodhounds to accompany him. The men left town before sunrise, armed with lanterns, rifles, and a warrant to search the property. Locals watched them disappear into the mist with a mix of relief and dread, for everyone knew that those woods had a way of swallowing what entered. The first sign of trouble came at dusk. The dogs, known for their steadiness, refused to go further than the tree line, whining and clawing at the dirt as if terrified of something unseen. The deputies pressed on without them, forcing their way through a landscape that seemed to shift with every step. The air grew thick, heavy with the odor of iron and decay. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun had all but vanished, leaving only the dim flicker of lanterns to guide their way. The door was unlocked, creaking open into darkness. Inside, they found signs of habitation, half-eaten food, candles burned to nubs, medical instruments scattered across a table, but no sign of the Ashworth family. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, many empty, some holding jars that glistened faintly when the light passed over them. One deputy swore he saw movement inside one of the jars, something that rippled like muscle beneath translucent skin, but before he could say more, a scream echoed from the cellar. Sheriff Harlan rushed to the source, but the narrow staircase was swallowed in darkness. The men descended one by one until the last of their lantern light faded into the floorboards above. Hours passed. The townsfolk waiting at the edge of the woods never saw them return. When a second search team arrived 2 days later, they found no trace of the sheriff or his men, only Harlan's badge, bent and streaked with dried blood, lying in the mud near the cabin's door. The cellar entrance was gone, sealed by what looked like freshly turned earth. After that, the county quietly closed the case, declaring the men missing in action. For decades, the story was spoken only in whispers. Hunters claimed that if you stood near the ruins at night, you could hear muffled voices rising from beneath the ground, as if the sheriff and his men were still trapped down there, calling for a way out that would never come. When investigators finally dared to unearth the ground beneath the ruined Ashworth cabin decades later, what they found transformed legend into something far more disturbing. Hidden beneath a trapdoor disguised by rotted floorboards was a narrow staircase descending into darkness, the air below damp and cold, smelling faintly of formaldehyde and something older, something dead. The chamber at the bottom was a single, low-ceilinged room carved directly into the earth, its walls lined with shelves, jars, and rusted instruments that had fused together with age. It was not the crude shelter of a family seeking isolation, but a laboratory, a place of deliberate design and morbid purpose. Against the far wall stood several iron tables, their surfaces etched with deep scratches as if something had clawed against them. Old anatomy charts, yellowed and brittle, clung to the walls, showing the human body in various states of dissection, some marked with handwritten notes in faded ink. In the center of the room, a wooden table stood intact, surrounded by dozens of small glass containers filled with murky fluid. Inside each jar floated a specimen, some animal, many unmistakably human. Eyes, hands, fetuses, and skin fragments were suspended in the thick liquid, labeled with dates ranging from 1919 to 1945. Some of the jars bore names scratched into the lids, while others carried only initials or symbols. What horrified the forensic team most was the meticulousness of it all. This was not random madness but organized obsession. Whoever had worked here had documented every incision, every preserved piece, as if building an archive of human anatomy for reasons no one could comprehend. In one corner, they found a metal sink connected to what appeared to be an improvised drainage system, leading deeper underground into a tunnel that collapsed only a few feet in. Traces of blood, both animal and human, were still detectable in the rusted basin. Nearby, a small wooden chair was found facing the table, its legs bound with wire and the seat stained black. The walls bore faint markings, lines carved by a blade, tally marks counting something lost to time. The deeper they explored, the more apparent it became that this chamber had not been abandoned in haste, it had been buried intentionally. The trapdoor above had been sealed shut from below, as if whoever remained inside had chosen to close themselves off from the world above. When the investigators resurfaced, shaken and pale, several refused to return for further excavation. The photographs they took were later confiscated by the state, filed under restricted access. Only fragments of their notes survived, and they spoke of the same haunting realization that the Ashworths had built not a home, but a sanctuary for their experiments, and that the forest had grown over it like a tomb trying to keep the truth buried forever. When forensic analysts began studying the contents of the jars recovered from the Ashworth site in the 1970s, they expected to find traces of simple preservation chemicals like alcohol, formalin, or arsenic compounds common in early medical practices. Instead, what they discovered defied both science and reason. The fluid inside the jars was unlike anything on record, thick, amber-colored, and faintly luminous when exposed to light. Samples were sent to multiple laboratories, yet none could fully identify its composition. Standard tests revealed an organic base that appeared to regenerate itself when exposed to air, almost as if the fluid were alive. Even after being sealed away for decades, it had not evaporated or degraded. In some cases, it seemed to react to temperature changes, thickening and pulsing faintly under observation. One scientist described it as a substance with memory, a liquid that behaved as though aware of the biological matter it contained. What unsettled researchers even more was the state of the remains preserved within. Human tissue that should have long decayed was perfectly intact, veins visible beneath translucent skin, and eyes that appeared disturbingly lifelike. Microscopic examination revealed that the cells inside were not entirely dead. They showed faint traces of metabolic activity, impossible by modern understanding. When questioned, locals recounted old stories about Ellis Ashworth's obsession with stopping decomposition, his belief that death was a reversible process. Some said he had once boasted to a traveling preacher that he could bottle the soul itself if given the right ingredients. None had taken him seriously then, but the evidence suggested he might have succeeded in creating something far beyond preservation, a substance that bound life and death together in one grotesque suspension. Further investigation uncovered fragments of handwritten notes in the debris near the cabin. They were water-damaged and partially burned, but the words that could be read mentioned binding agents, organic electricity, and a cryptic phrase repeated several times: "The body remembers." Some experts speculated that Ashworth might have discovered or synthesized a biological compound capable of preserving tissue through continuous microscopic activity. Others believed the substance wasn't a creation at all but something found, harvested from a natural or supernatural source hidden within the Appalachian earth. Those who handled the fluid reported strange sensations afterward: numbness, vivid dreams, and in one case, a recurring whisper that seemed to echo from inside the jars themselves. Eventually, the samples were sealed and transferred to a government facility under classified status. Officially, the investigation ended there, marked unexplained organic anomaly. But among the few who examined the Ashworth fluid firsthand, a lingering fear remained that the family had uncovered something humanity was never meant to touch, and that somewhere in those woods, the formula that blurred the line between life and death still seeps into the soil, waiting for another curious hand to find it again. When the ruins of the Ashworth property were catalogued in the early 1970s, investigators found an old metal trunk buried beneath a pile of collapsed beams in what was once the main room of the cabin. Inside were several glass cylinders, each carefully wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. At first, they were assumed to be containers for chemical samples, but when one was accidentally knocked over, it released a faint crackling sound, an old phonograph recording. Once cleaned and examined, it became clear that the trunk held a dozen phonograph cylinders, each labeled with a date and a single word like test, harvest, or sermon. They were sent to the state archives for restoration, and when technicians finally played the first recording, the sound that emerged from the speakers made even the most skeptical listeners uneasy. The cylinders did not contain music or dictation but an eerie mixture of human sounds, low chanting, rhythmic and drawn out, interrupted by sudden moans, and the unmistakable whir of surgical tools. Some of the chants were in Latin, others in a language no one could identify, layered beneath a steady dripping noise like water or blood falling onto metal. On one of the longer recordings, a man's voice, identified through comparison to old documents as Dr. Ellis Ashworth himself, could be heard calmly instructing someone to restrain the subject. Moments later came a violent struggle and a scream that cut short, followed by Ashworth's voice murmuring, "She's awake this time." Good. The reaction must be witnessed. The sound that followed was so disturbing that 2 technicians refused to continue the playback. Not all the recordings were violent. Some captured what sounded like prayer services or sermons delivered in the same steady, emotionless tone. In one, Ellis spoke about the divine architecture of flesh and the idea that the human body was merely a vessel to be perfected, not wasted. In the background of several recordings were faint sobs, and once, the voice of a young girl whispering, "Please stop, Papa." Forensic audio experts later enhanced the tapes, revealing strange frequencies beneath the audible range, low vibrations that caused physical discomfort to anyone listening for too long. The recordings were eventually sealed under evidence protection after reports surfaced that those who handled them experienced nausea, insomnia, and in some cases, auditory hallucinations of breathing and whispering when no sound was present. Despite being locked away, copies were rumored to circulate among collectors of the occult. Those who claimed to have heard the full series described the final cylinder as the worst of all. It ended with a sound like wet movement, a deep inhalation, and then silence except for a faint, rhythmic heartbeat that continued long after the recording should have ended, pulsing slow and steady, as if something on the other side of the cylinder was still alive. In 1998, decades after the official investigation into the Ashworth family had faded into obscurity, a young documentary filmmaker named Daniel Price arrived in Boone County determined to uncover the truth. He had spent years researching forgotten cases and backwoods folklore, and when he stumbled across an old article about the Ashworth discovery, he became obsessed. The story, to him, was more than local legend, it was unfinished history. Daniel brought with him a small film crew and a set of handheld cameras, intending to record a documentary about the body merchants of eastern Kentucky. Locals warned him not to go near the hollow, especially after dark, but Daniel laughed it off, dismissing their fear as superstition. He and his crew set up camp near the remnants of the Ashworth property, just as autumn began to settle over the forest, turning the leaves a deep, blood-like red. The footage recovered later painted a timeline of their final days. The first recordings showed Daniel's enthusiasm, interviewing old residents who reluctantly recalled the Ashworth name. The next few reels captured their journey into the woods, with each frame growing darker, the light dimmer, and the forest unnervingly quiet. On the third night, the crew recorded strange noises coming from the direction of the cabin site, soft, rhythmic thuds followed by what sounded like faint whispers. When they investigated, the camera caught glimpses of something unnatural: glass fragments half buried in the soil, a rusted surgical lamp still upright, and what looked like a wooden cross carved with symbols no one could identify. The final piece of footage, later found online years after their disappearance, was only 23 minutes long. It began with Daniel's face illuminated by the glow of a lantern, his expression stripped of all confidence. He whispered that they had found a tunnel leading underground, one not listed in any of the old reports. The camera shook as they descended, the sound of dripping liquid echoing through the dark. Then came a low hum, mechanical and wet, followed by Daniel's voice saying, "It's moving." The frame went black, but the audio continued: rapid breathing, footsteps, and something else beneath it, a slow pulse like a heartbeat. The last minute of the recording showed a blur of motion and light before the camera fell sideways, landing on its lens. In the final seconds, faint reflections appeared in the glass faces, pale and pressed close, eyes open but unblinking, staring directly into the camera as if aware of being seen. No trace of Daniel or his crew was ever found. The equipment was discovered months later by hikers, but the tunnel they described could never be located again. Some believe the forest simply took them, the same way it had taken the Ashworths, absorbing anyone who dares disturb what sleeps beneath its soil.